I needed a small shanty for my Hodge Junction scene, and I knew this would be a great scratch building project for beginners, so I'm going to walk you through how I built it on Ron's Trains and Things right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and as an N-scaler, I often need structures and other elements for my layout that simply are not commercially available in my scale. If this is true of you as well, then that is a good reason and it's a good idea to build some skills in both kit bashing and scratch building. Now, I know that those skills can seem a little bit daunting if you're beginning at scratch building, but I promise you that it is easier to get started than you think, and that's exactly what I want to show you in this video today. So I'm going to be building this simple little shanty that I needed for my Hodge Junction scene, and this is a fantastic little simple project to begin with scratch building, so I want to show you exactly how I built it. Now, the tools and the techniques that I'm going to be using today are translatable into any scale, so you'll want to watch this, and I know you're going to learn some things that'll be helpful to you as a beginner scratch builder. So let's head on over to the workbench and let's build this shanty. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. With 15,000 square feet of inventory and one-day shipping, whether in person or online, they are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com, link in the description. For this little scratch build, I'm working only from one old, poor quality photo, so I'm making a lot of this build up as I go, but as long as it looks right, that is okay with me. In a previous video about Hodge Junction scenery, I had cut this little styrene foundation for the shanty from a scrap of 40,000 styrene. Based on the photos, I guessed at the dimensions of the shanty of about 12 feet by 12 feet. Measuring some old images on Google Earth confirmed that this approximation was pretty close. Also, standard wall heights are typically 8 feet on the inside, and this looks pretty standard, so these are the dimensions that I went with. Roofs in Texas tend to be flatter than those farther north where they get more snow. I know that 512 pitched roofs are pretty common in Texas, and this looks about like that, so that's the pitch that I went with. For those who may be unfamiliar with the terminology, when I say 512 pitch, that designates the rise over the run of the roof pitch. In other words, for every 12 inches of wall length, the roof rises 5 inches. In this case, with a 12-foot total wall length, the wall rises over the course of 6 feet to the center of the gable. Thus, it will rise 6 times 5 inches, or a total of 30 inches. That's 2.5 feet. So the side walls will be a scale 8 feet high, and the center of the gable will be a scale 10.5 feet tall. With my dimensions figured out, I marked and cut the end or gable walls first, using clapboard siding as is seen in the prototype photo. I'm using evergreen number 4051 clapboard siding, which is 40 thousandths of an inch thick and has 50 thousandths spacing of the boards. That comes out to about 8-inch wide boards in N-scale, which is a little wide, but it will work in this case. By the way, I will link the evergreen materials that I use in this project in my Amazon pick of the week in the description down below this video, so if you'd like to check them out, they will be there. I'm working on the back of the sheet because it's much easier to mark and cut the smooth surface than on the clapboard surface. Just make sure that you take into consideration the reverse angle of your work when working on the back of the sheet. Also, when building a gable structure like this, I always make my gable walls full length and compensate for the thickness of the plastic when cutting the side walls to tuck in between them. You see how I mark out the outline of the wall and cut it with a fresh number 11 blade. I used the first wall to mark the gable on the second wall, but then held them together to sand them so that they matched perfectly. For the side walls, I cut the height at a straight scale 8 feet tall, then cut the length. The 40 thousandths of an inch thickness of this styrene comes out to almost exactly 6 inches in N-scale, so compensating for the thickness of both end walls meant that I cut the side walls a scale 1 foot short, or 11 feet to scale. After all the walls were cut out, I checked and sanded them smooth to match their corresponding walls. Patience and precision here will pay dividends and save frustration in the building process later. My prototype photo shows a boarded up window on the back of the shanty, so I have to assume there is a standard sized door on the other side. For these, I used castings from Tichy Train Group, but I also sometimes use Grant Line castings and those from other suppliers as well. I just picked a solid, standard-sized door and a simple window casting that looked to be about the right size. This window casting was a scale 3 feet square. I cut the castings from their sprues, sanded them where the ejection gates had been, then measured them with a caliper so I could cut the holes. I used the caliper to mark the walls where the door and window openings needed to be. For the door opening, I used a nibbler to remove the plastic. It was exactly the right width. The opening only needed a slight bit of sanding for a perfect fit. For the window, I drilled small holes just inside the corners of the opening and cut between the holes with a hobby knife. Note that I'm working inside of my lines. I then used a file and some sanding sticks to file the opening to size and to square the corners until the casting fit just right. I cemented both castings into their respective walls using solvent cement. Plastruct plastic weld works well for this, but there are a number of other solvent cement options out there. Personally, I use MEK with a few bits of scrap styrene dissolved into it for filler. Again, the window is boarded up, so I cut a scrap of 10,000 styrene to fit in the window opening and cemented that into place. Then I began assembling the walls, using corner clamps to keep the first corner square and cementing the inside of the corner joints. When I had one corner cemented together, I fixed it to the foundation, then repeated the process with the other corner and the other pair of walls. I then cemented that assembly to the foundation, checking that everything was square, and I cemented the other corners into place. Again, take extra care and time here to keep everything square, straight, and aligned. Somehow I lost the footage of cutting the roof, but in short, I measured from the peak of the gable to the edge of the sidewall and added 1 scale foot for overhang. I then measured the outside from end wall to end wall and added 2 scale feet for overhang, 1 foot on each end, and I cut the 2 halves of the roof from 10,000 styrene from my scrap box. I aligned the 2 pieces at the ridge, then cemented them to the walls and to one another along the ridge. I sanded the side edges of these sections vertically so I could cement on fascia, which will be my next step. For fascia, I used 15 thousandths by 40 thousandths styrene strip from Evergreen. Rather than try to measure and cut these perfectly to length, I cemented the strip to the structure long, then trimmed it flush on each end. I started with the straight pieces on the side walls. I made sure the top of the fascia was flush with the top of the roof and trimmed the ends with my flush cutting tweezers. These are another absolute must-have tool for any builder in my opinion, and I'll link them in my Amazon Pick of the Week in the description as well. With the sides done, I turned to the fascia on the gable ends. Again, rather than try to cut the angles and the length right beforehand, I cemented a piece on long, then used my flush cutters and a hobby knife to cut the angles on each end. The result from this process came out looking pretty good in my opinion. When the fascia cement had dried well enough, I used a sanding stick to make sure all of the edges and corners were perfectly flush. Let Let me pause for just a moment to say that if you're enjoying this video and would like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques to help you build your dream layout, then be sure to subscribe down below and click the little bell icon so you can catch future videos. You can see here that I cut a scrap of 40,000 styrene for a stoop and glued it in front of the door. At this point, I used a coarse sanding stick to lightly sand a bit of grain into the boards, sanding only in the direction that would be with the grain of the wood. I also sanded the plywood that covered the window in a vertical direction. I used my hobby knife to cut some extra grain into the window cover, and I distressed it by cutting out bits of a couple of corners to match the prototype photo. I also sanded grain into the door and window trim. I created some knot holes in the siding with the point of my hobby knife, and I distressed the bottom board of the siding all the way around. I used the same strip as before to create corner trim, cementing it to cover the exposed edge of the end walls first, then cutting the top angle and flushing up a piece with it on the ends. Next, it was time for paint. Whatever paint this shanty once had is long gone, so I was looking to simulate bare, weathered wood, which means varying shades of gray. I started with a light gray coat, applying 2 coats as a primer and a base. I applied this to all the surfaces except for the roof. While that was drying, I applied a coat of burnt umber to the roof. The roof is going to be shingled, so I don't expect to see any of this paint, but adding the color is a safeguard in case any of the styrene shows through any place on the roof. When the base coat of gray had dried, I streaked the siding with the grain of the wood with various shades of gray, trying to leave a random streaking look. I also streaked on a bit of burnt umber under the leaves on the gable ends where the prototype shows a bit of brown weathered wood. When that had all dried, I applied a bit of dark green wash along the bottom board to simulate mold growing on the old wood. I also added some to the plywood over the window. Again, when that had dried, I applied a dark gray weathering wash from AK Interactive. This is an enamel wash, so it's best if you're finished with your acrylic work before applying this wash. This brings out the shadow areas, adds definition to the model, and ties the various gray colors together. I ended up applying this wash twice to get the color and effect I liked. I allowed all of that to dry overnight. Then I applied shingles to the roof. I used green strip 3-tab shingles from Motrack Models, and I applied them using Frost King double-sided tape, which is produced for weather stripping. I applied the tape to the roof, cut the ends flush with the fascia, then peeled off the backing on one side and started applying the shingles. These shingles go on pretty much like real 3-tab shingles. I lined the first row up with the edge of the roof and pressed it in place. I left each row long, then trimmed them along the roof edge with my hobby knife. You need to make sure you have a good sharp hobby knife blade for this. The next row of shingles aligns with the top of the gutters in the previous row, and the gutters offset halfway between the gutters of the previous row. I ended up taping the model to my work mat to hold it still as I worked. I worked my way up one side, then turned to the opposite side and repeated the process. The double-sided tape lacked a tiny bit of reaching the peak, so the last course of shingles on each side I glued down with a bit of canopy glue. For the ridge, in the past I have cut individual tabs and made a ridge, but the shingles are too thick for this to look realistic at end scale, so I cut a strip from the framing section of the shingle sheet, folded it in half lengthwise, and glued it to the ridge, which looks good. Cutting the shingles along the edge of the roof caused some paint damage to the fascia, so I touched this up on both ends. The prototype photo shows the roof to be extremely aged and worn. I didn't go quite to this extent, but I wanted to simulate some damage and neglect, so I cut away a few random tabs from the shingles, some singles and some in pairs. Where the roof is exposed underneath the shingles, the tape showed through and was quite shiny, so I used some burnt umber and gray paint to tone it down. I removed shingles from several locations on both sides of the roof. Finally, I weathered the roof with weathering powders from Monroe Models, using grimy black and dark earth. A little of these powders goes a long way, so I used a very small brush and applied a sparing amount at a time, which still produced a very grimy old roof look. I brushed the powders in streaks down the roof as rainwater would wash the grime down the surface. I also applied a bit of streaking under the sides of the windows. And with that, this little shanty was complete. I spent about 4 hours on this project over the course of a couple of nights, and as a result, I have a nice, unique old shanty for this scene that really tells a story about this yard in years gone by. I think if you try some of these techniques, you'll find that getting started in scratch building isn't nearly as difficult as you may think, so I hope you give it a try. To see more scratch building projects and other model railroad content, check out the links on your screen. Don't forget those Amazon Picks of the Week, links to my merch store, and other great information in the description down below. And join me on Fridays as I bring you even more great model railroad videos, and I'll see you on the next video. 10, Lizzie?